thoughtful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and students and faculty all the countries and listen to
Good evening and welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps for the first time here for ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, we can be found now every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. and Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, on top of the show, let me thank you for your very thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning previous shows we've aired here on ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, but particularly your ideas for guest topics and subjects to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. For after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show now proudly in its 32nd season. We have a great show planned for you today with a wonderful guest to talk about this HISD state takeover. What does it really mean? Why is it happening now? Under what guise are we trying to do this? And for what purpose and outcome? And yet we still have not figured out how to do right by the students in HISD, by the growing population of children of color. Now that the school district is a majority school district, 84% majority minority. The city of Houston itself is 6 or 7% majority minority. The schools are all resegregated again. We've gone from segregation to desegregation to integration, and now we're back to resegregation. The 7th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education is next year. People are already calling me, Larry, we need to have a glorious celebration and a program to, listen, why? What do we have to show? What progress have we made? We're taking steps backwards. Separate was always unequal. There was no such thing as separate but equal. Separate always meant unequal. So I've asked somebody to join us on the show this week who understands this at a deep level. Steve Onstead, who is joining me, was a principal in HISD for 29 years. His whole life has been dedicated to education with a wonderful program called Discover You, which he ran for a while, which I was proud to be on the board of, but not at the same time that he was the director. It was a great program. Cristo Rey High School, most recently, he was on that board, the wonderful Cristo Rey program that allows kids to really get education and to go forward. He's now the director of, I love this, Measuring What Matters. That phrase that I grew up with, even in my household, what matters gets measured. It doesn't matter, it doesn't get measured. Even as a kid, we figured that out, right? Is it going to be on the test? If it ain't going to be on the test, then it don't matter. So, and he does work with a wonderful institute for research and reform that he'll tell us probably more about that also. But I could go on and on about Steve's commitment and dedication to education. A great friend, glad to have him join us today, and welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Larry. It's a tremendous pleasure to join you today.
So I'll let you start. How do you see this? Why at this time is the state threatening to take over HISD, and what can, not so much what can be done, but is their failure over the years to do what they should have done that really has got us in this situation? As much as HISD not doing what it should have done, also it's a combination.
Yeah, I find this, I'm very saddened by the way things have progressed or regressed, depending on your viewpoint. But the things that have brought us here today, I think are very disappointing. It's certainly understandable that the state is frustrated that there are still schools in HISD and in other districts around the state and around the country that have continuously underperformed. And yes, there have been glimmers of progress and certainly hope. And we know that much more is possible. And so that frustration is, I think, quite legitimate. And we locally, as a school district and as a community, should be continually frustrated when we see students who are underachieving because they are being underserved. And when that goes on for years and years, there's lots of reason for concern and should be an impetus for action. And it's also a black eye on the state, because the state, through its lack of contribution of adequate resources, has helped continue this situation or help it persist. And so I think to recognize that there are schools that are still underperforming is an embarrassment for us locally, And it's also should be an embarrassment for the state who claims to be a leader in public education.
And just kind of back up a little bit. How do we get into this situation? I mean, at one time, HISD seemed to be perking pretty much on all cylinders. When the school district was still more than 50% Anglo students, things seemed to be perking, even though the minority schools always did have some challenges, but not as much as they've had over the last few years. It seems to me when the Anglo students left HISD is when things just started going down, down, and down.
That's an interesting question, and not one with a simple answer, not surprisingly. I know when I first, my first high school assignment as principal, they were getting ready to open West Side High School. And overnight, right, what was then Lee High School, with the opening of West Side High School, went from being a pretty good school to, by the numbers, being an awful school. And all that happened was a whole bunch of kids left.
Right.
And so I bring that up to say, we've always had a large number of students who were dramatically underperforming, but we've also had a large group of students who could mask those results and make things kind of look okay. And so Lee at the time looked okay because a small number of students were doing exceedingly well, and that disguised what was happening for the majority of the other students in that building. And so as those populations shift, I think what we're seeing is kind of a pulling back of the, a section of the onion, right? We're peeling the onion. And it's like, okay, this facade of everybody doing well really masks two systems that were in place. Mm-hmm. One doing well for some kids, and that same system not doing well for other kids. Now, right, it's just a lot harder, as it should be, for that kind of measurement and reporting to carry on. The focus and the shift in the way we look at data to look at subgroups more explicitly has really put a spotlight on the underperformance of our minority and certainly under-resourced youth over time. So I don't know how much things have changed or how much more we've exposed some of the problems that we've had for decades.
Well, as we find ourselves in the situation that we're in now, what do you see that can be done? Whether the state takes it over or not, there's still the issue of the gap in investments and funding. Whether the state takes it over or not, they're still going to have to put more money into it to make it work. That they have seemed not to want to do. Historically, they have been very hesitant to do that. We have the data from Rice University Kid Institute. We had Dr. Thurley on earlier. We know the numbers, we know the data, we know how much per pupil spending we need to invest more for each student. There has not been the will to do it, the political will or the civic will to push the agenda to make that happen. So we're still in this kind of catch-22 because it's still about investment.
Yeah. How do we mobilize, right, communities to lobby our legislatures to provide adequate funds? If we figure that out, right, we'll be in much better shape. I think there's a lot more we could do about educating the community about just how funding works or doesn't work in the state. Most people have no idea. I am lucky to teach graduate students who want to be administrators.
Right.
And they, coming into class, have little or no understanding of school finance and how schools are actually funded in the state of Texas, and where money comes from and where there are gaps and how those have changed over time. That's a group that should know more, right? So how do we bring that kind of informed citizen level of understanding to bear? And I think schools have a significant role to play in that. We should be educating our families. Sometimes I think we like to kind of paint a rosy picture, and that's not always in our best interest, right? To make things look better than they are, or to overlook the challenges, or dance around with some of the niceties. We just need to say that what's the investment in students is woefully inadequate, and the results will match that as long as that stays the same.
Is there no sense it seems, in the state of Texas, I think less so here in Houston, no sense of we anymore. These kids don't seem to enter on the radar screen of a big proportion population of this state that it's somebody else's problem. I've heard the phrase recently, "Those are not my children," which I thought was very interesting. I think the sense of no responsibility, no commitment, no reason to care, no empathy. Maybe we haven't given them enough reason to care, to have empathy. Maybe because we're the most diverse city in America, we're also the most gated community in America, according to Steve Kleinberg. We're also the most segregated community in America. And maybe because we live in our silos and we're spread out over so many square miles that we really don't care, because we don't see it, out of sight, out of mind, what happens in the urban area, what happens in the core of the city. We live in our suburbs. We live in the lakes and the countries, and it's just, to me, a disconnect. And I pushed down, I drilled down with the guy who made that statement. And what I learned from him, because I've known him for years, he said, this is a little group I meet with every week for breakfast, and this is kind of the sentiment that comes out of that group. Those are not our children. But it wasn't mean-spirited. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't even racist. He said, there's a disconnect. No one has given me a reason to care. My kids went to public school. My grandkids are in public schools, not in any of the schools we're talking about in the urban area. I've done that. I've been there. I'm taking care of my children. Those are not my children.
There's been a real strain, I think, in our communities and across the country, and thinking about the common good, right?
Yeah.
For which education was created, right? It was a common good.
For the sake of the democracy. That's how we
For
get
the sake of the democracy, right? It's in everybody's best interest to have an informed and educated citizenry. That's been really difficult. And I think schools have been asked to increasingly take on a role in their communities that they had, but not at the same level. And by that, I mean, in many communities, the school is the only common institution, or for many communities.
Yeah.
Places of worship had a major role, but those have diminished over time. Other kinds of civic organizations and places in our communities had roles, but many of those have vanished or are certainly diminished. And schools have had to try fill that gap. You know, what does it mean to be the center of the community, right? Part of the glue that binds us all together on a neighborhood basis, right? In my community. And I don't think, one, that's what schools were originally designed for. I know it's not what we were trained to do in teacher or principal school.
Right.
And so thinking about how do we engage with all of our community when we're struggling to engage with our school families is a tremendous challenge, one that we can get better at. And there's certainly a lot of learning we can do, but it's not an easy one, and it takes resources. To your earlier point about, to get better means we need to do things better. And that means sometimes that we've got to invest significantly to provide time, talent, and other resources.
Mm-hmm. So the question I have to start asking more and more, for those who say they care, and there's a large population that say they care, and there's a multicultural population, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious, how can they come together and figure out what needs to be done? Because it's going to happen from them, because it's not going to happen from the other side. And I'm using side here loosely. It seems to me that the role of the citizen, of the constituent, of the congregant has to come into play for those who say they care and have empathy. This is a question of empathy. Equity has always been a question of empathy. No empathy, no equity. And to build the relationships to be able to come together to say that this is what we expect and demand from our community. This is what we're willing to do, to invest time, talent, treasure to make it happen, and touch, the other T we always forget. And to really talk about how we can come and put together the pieces we need to make it happen, and to leverage the state, to leverage those who need to be leveraged, to educate them, to try to get them at least to see and understand that these kids they're talking about or not talking about are human beings who deserve, just like every other citizen, every other student, not just to survive, not just to thrive, but to flourish. Human beings were meant to flourish to the fullness of their God-given potential. And that's our future workforce. That's our future city, our future state, our future nation. We're not doing right by them, and yet we expect to have a return on investment and an outcome that gives us the workforce we need to be able to compete. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. With the majority of these kids being minorities, who's going to do it if you don't educate them?
Yeah, I think you spoke passionately about empathy, and I agree wholeheartedly. We are more willing to invest in and care about and take action on behalf of people we know and care about than the stranger, the person we don't.
Yeah.
Right. And we can see, Larry, you mentioned at the beginning, Cristo Rey Jesuit, I think that model is a tremendous example of creating empathy within the community. So every single child at Cristo Rey, every single student has a job.
Yep.
Right? They go to work 1 day a week in the office buildings downtown and in the medical center and in other places of business, right? Where they are, on the floor in the office with people they would never meet from very different walks of life. They're working, right, in prestigious companies, and the people in those companies are meeting a high school student from a community and a background very different than their own, and they're developing and building that empathy and that care for that young person, right? And the model is built on that, right? So it's a community interaction with the young people themselves and members of the community. That's one way, right? So thinking
and relationships
again about
that go with that.
The relationships that go with that, and those relationships pay off in huge ways.
Yes.
Some of those kids are getting hired, they're going on to college, and then they're coming back to those firms and getting hired. Those firms are investing in those young people in their education, not just through high school, but in many cases well beyond, because they care and they recognize the talent and the skills and the abilities and the value of that young person as a person, right? Again, thinking about how do we do that on a grander scale, right? And how do we make help our schools be centers of community again that bring people in and help build those relationships? And how do we get our students out into the community to reinforce and showcase that? It's not a fix-all, but I think it's an important piece. As long as school only happens in a schoolroom, it's going to be harder to build empathy and connections and relationships.
So should we start with a new definition of what the common good looks like? And what is the common good? Because the common good, it seems to me, is the piece that pushes people to really get to the point of what do they truly believe, because our belief system drives our values. And obviously, if we don't value these young people, if we don't see them as fully human beings, if, the legacy of slavery in this discussion about public urban education is such a carryover until you cannot escape that. The whole black-white paradigm has been based all these years on slavery. And the way Black people have always been seen as less than and not fully human still carries over, it seems to me, in some of this discussion and debate, because if they were seen as fully human and fully therefore equal, we would not treat them the way we have treated them and continue to treat them. And now, add the new larger population of these brown students, Hispanic, Latino students, who are just overwhelming the system and feeling that they're entitled to a good education, which they are. And then you add all that together. So now you have Anglos who are feeling displaced, being replaced, being nervous, being stressful, being anxiety. And all of that is because you haven't done right by these students. If you had, you would not have those feelings of stress, of fear, of anxiety. So we're in this interesting place, it seems to me, that we have to come together and figure out the 2024, 23, 24 version of what the common good really is. We do charity. You mentioned that earlier. We're great at charity. We will do charity every day. We love charity. We don't do justice. We love downstream. We're reactionary. We've never been proactive to go upstream and solve the problem to start with. So we got to figure out, is that model, look what that model has gotten us by focusing downstream and not upstream.
You know, I think, you know, as you talk about some of those challenges, in some ways I'm heartened at the same time. I also think back to times where it wasn't that long ago, we didn't let children with disabilities come to school.
Oh, yes, right.
Right. Among others, right? And we've made some significant progress in a lot of areas. And yet it's fits and starts and backsliding, and we haven't made the progress, as much progress as I think we're capable of, and as much progress as we need to have made. But we do know from at least some examples that progress is possible.
Yes, it is. I agree with that.
Right? And that is heartening. This is not an impossible, although it's incredibly difficult. And society shifted, and schools learned and are still learning to work with children with disabilities.
I don't want to cut you off, but we're about out of time. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to get in anything that you want to get in that you didn't get a chance to say, because we got to get out of here. It went by very quickly.
Yeah. That piece about finding the common good, right? And the encouragement for all of us to find ways to engage with our local schools and our school systems. We don't have to be experts. There's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of ways to invest in the lives of children and to be a caring adult in many kinds of roles.
Right.
And all of our children, school age and otherwise, need more caring adults. And in doing that, getting to know a child well and being involved in their life, you can't help but be more involved in their educational outcomes and want to be an advocate on their behalf for better outcomes.
Amen. Well said. Thank you, Steve. Let me close with this in the quick minute I have left to tell me. And I'm going to raise up my name of my mentor and friend who's recently passed, Dr. Robert Bob Houston from the University of Houston Institute for Urban Public Education, where we served together. He was the director, I was associate director for a while. We had this little thing about how do we make progress? We make progress on any issue through three things: scope, schedule, and cost. What's the scope? What's the objectives we're trying to achieve? What's the schedule for milestone and deliverables? What's the investment? The cost is always about investments. The quality of what you get from that is the combination of the outcome of scope, schedule, and cost. We need to figure out very simply, what are we going to do, and use perhaps that model to begin to talk about a new way, as Steve talked about, not only to get at the common good, but to think about really what do we want out of the outcome of this investment that we've never done properly, and in this investment in public urban education. We never separate those three words, urban public education, because the social, economic, political realities that go with urban is very important to public education. This is not rural education. This is not suburban education. This is urban public. And all those factors, the social, economic, political realities, have to be taken into consideration as you go forward. So I think we are at a milestone. We're at an inflection point. We are able, I think, because of the great, wonderful, caring human beings we have in Houston, to rise to the occasion. After deeper searching of the heart, we now rise to play a greater part. And I think we all need to search deeply in our heart to find out what that new role we need to play, what that new understanding we need to have, and talk to people outside of your circle, outside of your silo. Get their input, see what they're thinking, see what they're feeling, and see what children they have worked with and volunteered to help and serve. You have great examples all around this city. And so I think when we get outside of our bubble, we become the bridge and the connector to others. We talk to people who give us firsthand witness of what can be done and what has been done. We share remarkable stories along the journey, because it's all about the stories along the journey. We talk about those stories that help us to understand how to have and develop empathy. The road to equity is empathy. We get outside of our circles, we develop new relationships, as Steve talked about, of mutual trust and respect. Why? Because nothing happens without trust. No one does anything to or for another human being that they do not trust. So the questions are there, the solutions are there, they're at our disposal. We just have to rise to make them happen. I think that we are challenged now in our lives, in our public, personal, and professional lives, to figure this out, to understand our roles as citizens, constituents, and congregants. Those of us who say we believe with a big B, and belief is one of those interesting things, right? We fall into belief and unbelief 100 times a day, which is great. It keeps us nimble, it keeps us asking questions. But at the same time, we have to be honest with ourselves about what do we really truly believe? What do we truly believe? And act upon those beliefs, turn that into values, turn those values into actions, and do something. I gotta go. Until we come together again for Dialogue Houston, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the communication in between shows. We look forward to you joining us on future segments of Dialogue Houston. Until then, as always, be well, be safe, and peace, power, and love.
How prepared is your family if a tornado shows up at your doorstep, or a flood, or a hurricane? You can't just turn away a natural disaster. That's why it's important to go to ready.gov/plan now. It has the tools and tips you need to make an emergency plan with your family. So if disaster comes knocking,
Let's go.
you'll be ready to help keep your family safe.
It's just a pizza.
Make a plan today.
When I was your age, I was just like you, fascinated by stars. But now I get to search for life in the universe. And who knows, maybe life is looking for us too.
So we're like aliens to them?
Yeah. Does anyone want to be a scientist now?
I do.
Awesome. We need more girls in STEM.
Maybe we can find aliens.